Dave Ramsey is no stranger to controversial opinions. Many people take issue with his approach to paying off debts, saying that his debt snowball approach is mathematically inefficient. I can't argue with those people, because it is, assuming that you're able to stick with the more mathematically efficient approach like the debt avalanche from start to finish. Some people do find that more difficult, so they opt to use a strategy like the snowball, even if only in the beginning, just to get the ball rolling. And I have no problem with that. The point is to get your debt situation under control. Other people argue that his investing expectations are unrealistic. He says that you can expect to earn an average of 12% per year on your investments. And again, I find it hard to argue with the naysayers. Most investors do not earn quite that much. In fact, most investors fail to even match the returns of the broader markets as a whole. US stocks have averaged annual returns of roughly 10% per year historically. But similar to the debt payoff strategy issue, I don't really have that much of a problem with this aspirational messaging. I certainly would like to have a more reasonable expectation to be set, and to be fair, Dave does sometimes step away from that 12% figure when giving people advice, suggesting that he's more focused on the importance of investing as opposed to being married to chasing those returns. But some assets have seen returns at least in the neighborhood of 12% per year over extended periods of time, particularly if you manage to enter at a decent date. So while I may not consider it an ideal expectation to set, it's also not necessarily inherently dangerous. It just needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. However, there is one expectation that Dave has been setting, which has been making the rounds in financial circles in the last couple of months, that could be financially dangerous if taken at face value. And that's Dave's view on minimum safe withdrawal rates. So let's talk about it. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a 30-day free trial of Audible and 2 free audiobooks of your choice, as well as a list of some books on money I'd recommend checking out with your free trial. On the November 2nd, 2023 episode of The Dave Ramsey Show, Dave got a call asking how to turn the caller's investments into income when that investor eventually retires. Specifically, the caller wanted to know whether they should be initially withdrawing 3, 4, or 5% of their nest egg based on an article that they had read on Ramsey's website and a previous video that had been posted by Ramsey co-host George Kamel. I'm not going to rehash the entire 9-minute clip as it's not really the main point of this video, but to summarize, Dave was frustrated. Here are some quotes from his response to the question. As you can imagine, this sort of response generated quite a bit of outrage in the finance community. It's one thing to disagree. It's another to do it in an angry and dismissive way. If you want to see the clip to get the full context of the call, I'll leave a link to the full episode in the description below. The segment for this call starts at the 1 hour, 13 minute, 36 second mark of the episode. So now that we know what Dave said and why it caused such a stir in financial circles, we can get into the topic in a bit of a broader sense, starting with a very foundational question. What is a safe withdrawal rate, actually? Then we can explore the assumptions behind safe withdrawal rates and how an 8% withdrawal rate might fare historically. So first things first, a safe withdrawal rate simply represents the percentage of your investments that you can withdraw in the first year of retirement, which allows you to survive for a specific length of time without running out of money, at least based on the historical volatility and returns that your investments have achieved, as well as the inflation that we've experienced over those time periods. The most common example where a safe withdrawal rate has been used is the 4% rule, which is just a rule of thumb that states that, based on history, if you have a well-diversified portfolio, you can reasonably expect to be able to withdraw 4% of your nest egg in the first year of retirement and adjust that dollar amount every year thereafter for inflation for at least 30 years without running out of money. That's it. That's all it is. It's just a number drawn from backtesting data. Where it can sometimes get confusing is in the assumptions that are baked into that idea. So let's go over some of those. One of the assumptions that's baked into the idea of a safe withdrawal rate is that you will adjust your withdrawals every year for inflation. For some people, that assumption may mostly line up with their lived reality, but many other people will experience a much more inconsistent annual expense adjustment. Some years they'll have big expenses, such as a new car, or a big vacation, or medical bills that require larger withdrawals than what's typically allowed by the standard inflation adjustment. Other years they may not have the need for an adjustment at all, or they'll even see their spending fall a little bit. Perhaps they paid off a mortgage or just didn't travel as much that year. Whatever the case may be, this assumption is something worth keeping in mind because for a lot of people, it won't line up with their lived reality. The retirement spending smile illustrates this idea really well. showing that most retirees see their inflation-adjusted spending drop, especially in the middle years of their retirement, before rising back up again when the growth in medical-related costs starts outpacing inflation. A second assumption is that you will have a broadly diversified portfolio, similar to the ones that were used to conduct the studies. However, this also won't always be the case for everyone. Some people will have a lot of their money tied up in company stock. Others may avoid stocks entirely, or keep much of their money in international investments. It is worth noting that most of the early popular studies around safe withdrawal rates had a US-centric focus. So it's important to remember that the safe withdrawal rate of 4% is not gospel. It was simply the result for the very specific allocation that was used in those popular studies, based on the data that was available to the researchers at that time. As we saw in the asset allocation series on this channel, depending on the investments you choose, your safe withdrawal rates can vary quite wildly. For example, the all-stock portfolio, which closely resembled an S&P 500 index fund in the series, had a historical safe withdrawal rate of roughly 3.68% before taxes and expenses since 1970. The Golden Butterfly, on the other hand, produced a safe withdrawal rate of 5.66% over that same time period. Quite a difference. A third assumption is that the retiree will want their money to last them a minimum of 30 years, which may not always be the case. If a retiree doesn't start drawing down on their portfolio until they're 95, they probably won't need their money to last them 30 more years. But if they retire in their 30s, they might need it to last them 50, 60 years or more. It's worth noting that according to the US Census Bureau, the average length of retirement is roughly 18 years. A fourth common assumption of the 4% rule is that the retiree desires a historical success rate at, or at least very near, 100%, which is probably a reasonable assumption for a lot of people, but again, it isn't necessarily going to be true for everybody. Some people would be perfectly willing to go back into the workforce for a few years if they saw their nest egg shrinking quicker than they'd like, especially if it meant that they could start their retirement earlier or have a higher income in retirement. So for people in that position, a historical success rate of 85 or 90% might be good enough. And if that's the case, the acceptable initial withdrawal rate would probably be a little bit higher. And as we saw from some of his quotes, Dave makes some assumptions as well. In addition to the already mentioned assumptions regarding retirement lengths and acceptable success rates, there's also the implicit assumption of linear and consistent returns year in and year out. We all know that that doesn't usually happen, even if the long-term average does come out to be about what we expect. And Dave knows that as well. I'm not trying to suggest that he doesn't, but it is a potential point of confusion when he says things like, if you're earning 12% and inflation is 4%, what's left over to withdraw is 8%, as he does in this particular segment. In reality, sequence of return risk, or the risk that the early returns you receive will be worse than expected, is an important consideration, and if we ignore that fact, it could lead to an undesirable outcome, as we've covered many times before on this channel. There's also the implicit assumption that our psychology and emotions will not get the best of us during stressful times such as market crashes when we see the value of our portfolios plummeting. With all that in mind, let's put some numbers to it to see why Dave's advice, if taken at face value, could be dangerous in the wrong situation. Now, to my knowledge, Dave has never listed any specific funds or even asset classes that he recommends investing in. The closest I've heard him get to specifics is to invest in 4 asset categories: growth, growth and income, aggressive growth, and international. Based on an article on his website entitled How to Invest in Mutual Funds, I put together a portfolio that matched up with those 4 categories. It had you invest in 5 different asset classes: a large cap blend and value fund, a small and mid cap growth fund, and an international stock fund. The large cap funds each get 12.5% of the money, while the rest of the funds get 25% apiece. As we saw in the analysis video on this portfolio, it was very much a boom and bust approach. When times were good, the returns were pretty difficult to beat, and it tended to bounce back from downturns quite strongly. But those downturns could be quite severe when they did hit. As a result of this, its safe withdrawal rates were not the highest, but they also certainly weren't the lowest, with a 30-year minimum safe withdrawal rate since 1970 of just under 4% before taxes and expenses come into play. If you had chosen to use a withdrawal rate of 8% with this portfolio, you would have still had some money left over by the 30-year mark in about 60% of all available starting years since 1970. Now, in Dave's defense, this isn't necessarily giving him the full benefit of the doubt when it comes to those baked-in assumptions. For example, the success rate rises from 60 to 68% if the assumed retirement length is the average of 18 years instead of 30. And no doubt the chances of success would rise higher if some of the other assumptions, like the more dynamic year-to-year changes in spending, also turned out to be more favorable than the standard inflation adjustment figures. Or if we added in the assumption that people would tighten their belts during down markets, using a flexible spending budget as we covered in that asset allocation series. Dave often preaches the virtues of being debt-free and sticking to a zero-based budget, so maybe he's assuming that those skills will translate to the viewers spending less money than most studies assume. It honestly wouldn't shock me if that was the case, but if it is the case, it wasn't mentioned in his response to the caller's question in this segment. Still, the key takeaway I hope you get from this video is that retirement planning is not always as simple as the 4% rule, and it's not as simple as taking the average long-term return earned minus a static inflation rate either. We have to consider the baked-in assumptions, both mentioned and potentially unmentioned, as well as how we want to live. Are we okay with picking up some part-time work, either temporarily during market downturns or more consistently throughout retirement to help fill our days and help us socialize? Do we have big-ticket items that we're going to be purchasing in the near future? And if so, do we have money already set aside for those purchases, or is the money to buy those things going to come from our nest egg? How do other possible sources of income like Social Security factor into our plan? Is the standard inflation-adjusted approach that the 4% rule models the right strategy for the lifestyle we want to lead after exiting the workforce? Or is there a better withdrawal strategy out there? And so on and so forth. There's a lot of nuance to this topic, a lot of details to consider. That's why there's an entire retirement planning industry. That's why there's so many nerds living in their mother's basement running these calculations, as Dave says. Personal finance is, above all, personal. And I don't think there's a single subject in which that is more clear than planning out how to best enjoy our golden years. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. If you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.